What is up, everybody? I am Kevin Ioli. Thank you for joining me. What a big day today. Huge news broke. The lawsuit that has been going on for 9+ years into its 10th year between about 1,200 fighters and the UFC was settled. The UFC has agreed to pay $335 million to the fighters, pending the approval of District Court Judge in Nevada, Richard Boulware. Joining me right now is an economics professor at Pepperdine University and a sports writer who has followed this case for Forbes, Paul Gift. Paul, thank you for joining me. Quite a day. I know you have been following this case very carefully. What's your reaction that it's finally over now?
I can't believe it's over now. Both of them are over, right? It seemed like it was going to go on forever with this initial Lee case, and then what the Johnson case was about to July 2017 through today, and they're both over. I don't know. It feels almost like a weight is off my shoulders, even though I wasn't involved in the case. But I've been tracking every detail of this case from day one, from December of 2014, and we were about to head into trial. But it doesn't look like that's happening anymore. So surprised, but also not surprised because settlement is always the most likely outcome in antitrust cases.
What was at stake here? So, and just for people who haven't followed this case or who are, I don't think too many people are antitrust experts or economic experts. If you can tell the layperson, what was at stake? What did the fighters say? What was their argument, and what was the UFC's argument in its defense?
The fighters argument, a lot of people think it is directly about the fighters. This case was indirectly about the fighters. It was directly about the UFC's competitors. So the fighters came in and said that the UFC was acquiring their competitors using long-term exclusive contracts to keep competitors from accessing fighter services, and then coercing fighters when they get towards the end of their contract to re-sign. And the effect of that was to keep a critical resource, which is fighters. If you're going to put on an MMA promotion, last I checked, you need fighters to keep that critical resource from the UFC's competitors. So normally those competitors would be upset and they would be the ones suing. That was the unique part of this case, is that the competitors weren't suing. It was the fighters suing, saying you're hurting these competitors. And then because of that, our pay is being lowered. Right? The UFC was basically saying, we're just doing business as usual. Our contracts are not that long. Yes, they are exclusive, but we have legitimate business reasons for doing it. When you compare us to other sports, we have some of the shortest contracts out there, around 2 or 2.5 years, right? As opposed to 5, 6, 7-year contracts. So they were saying things of that sort, and we could get a little bit more technical, but I don't know if
yeah, we don't want
to hear all that.
We don't want to get too technical because it's going to go over the head of about 99.99% of the people, and we don't want to do that. But I guess, one of the questions that would come out of this, from your view, was the UFC in the wrong here? Because you're sitting here and they're doing business, they're trying to be the best promotion they can be, just like Bellator tried to be the best promotion they could be, or PFL or any other, one championship, any other competitor that is in the marketplace. From your standpoint, was there anything on the plaintiff side that, you thought, hey, the UFC is in fact, stifling competition and has created an illegal monopoly, or the word of the day, I think today, is monopsony. I don't think a lot of people know what a monopsony is. So
they should basically just think of it as monopoly is basically a lot of seller power. Monopsony is a lot of buyer power. And the UFC and other MMA promoters buy the services of fighters. But what people should, the way I like to explain it in terms of what it was about to be like going into trial, is that the plaintiffs were going to walk into trial with the optics on their side. They were going to have fighters on the witness stand testifying, learning about their pay. Their pay is not nearly as high as other major sports that we know of, right? So that doesn't look good. The UFC from 2010 to 2017, which is what this case was going to be about, was becoming enormously profitable, right? And then let's just call them, I don't know, unflattering emails and text messages that were going to come out, right? With Dana White, Lorenzo Fertitta, Joe Silva. I think there was a Mike Mersch one in there. So they had all that on their side. That was going to sort of tug on the jury's heartstrings. But people find it hard to believe. But when you look at the economic fundamentals were on the UFC side. That's what they had going for them. So it was going to be that battle. Basically, in order for the plaintiffs to even have their case exist, they had to try to make the claim that a fighter's pay in dollars did not matter. What matters is your pay as a percentage of event revenue. That's important because it led to this. They would have to walk into court and say that when a fighter wins their fight, they do not make extra money, even though we all know that objectively to be false. It's just called a win bonus. Like 94% of the time it came out in this case, fighters double their money. They're going to have to do that. They're going to have to walk into court and say that MMA output of events has been reduced, even though I think most fans would agree there's so much MMA on TV, you're overwhelmed by it, right? There's so much MMA out there. People who cover it, you're like, I never get a weekend off. I know, I never get a weekend off. They were going to have to go in and argue that MMA promoters didn't have access to fighters. Now, you can make that argument, but the executives from those promotions were going to be under oath saying, yes, we did have access to fighters and we could compete. So that's what was going to go down, right? The plaintiffs had the optics all on their side, but the UFC had a lot of the fundamentals on their side. So it was still very dangerous for plaintiffs, right? They still had significant things that they would have had to overcome in that trial. So this settlement sort of gets rid of those obstacles. Now, they were going for 800 million to 1.6 billion in damages. And if you win, it can be tripled. So yeah, theoretically, you could get up to 4.8 billion. Now they're at 335 million, but they had a lot of things that they still had to overcome in their case. And my guess is that the mediation process, which is what these two parties were engaging in before the trial with an impartial retired judge, I'm guessing that mediator did a good job of helping each side see, some of the weaknesses that they had.
So a lot of people get these things in the mail where, hey, you may be part of a class action lawsuit. Where I got one the other day about Walmart about buying oranges, right? So I might get $10 back if this the judge approves the thing. But they always say if you object to the settlement. Is there any chance, in your opinion, that you might see some fighters object to the settlement and say it's not high enough? And if there's enough of them, could that then turn this case back maybe onto a trial track?
Just my opinion, I don't think so from the fighter side. The question would be the judge. The judge can still do it, right? I think he's much more of a question, right? If he thinks the monetary amount is okay, given the aspects of the case that he's seen, if what Nate Corey said is true, that it looks like there are zero contractual changes, right? That was supposed to be the essence of this case, is that we're doing this in order to bring more competition for fighters' services so that their pay can improve. And if what Nate Corey is saying is true, that you're not getting any, then I'm assuming it would be hard for the judge to kind of go against what these two parties have agreed on. But that doesn't look that good from the plaintiff's side, that you are filing it to make these changes and then you're really not getting these changes. I'm guessing what they're going to argue is the process of the case itself made some changes. Since 2014, the UFC has actively changed some of their contractual terms, the sunset clause, the 5-year sunset, and other things. So I'm guessing that's how they'll end up spinning it.
Interesting. So what do you think? How does the future hold now for these fighters? So what do the fighters do going forward? Because now that the UFC, it looks to me like, I was going to say now that they won the case, and I guess maybe I should stop myself and say they didn't necessarily win the case, right? Because they are paying out $335 million, and even if it's tax deductible, that's a lot of money that they are paying out, but certainly not what it could have been, or I think what a lot of people expected it to. So how do you think that business goes forward? Post once the Judge Boulware, if he decides to certify the settlement.
And to give people some perspective on that, the UFC's annual earnings is a little bit over $750 million right now. So 335 million is a little bit less than half of 1 year's earnings.
So 2 quarters. Basically, they're going to turn over 2 quarters to these fighters for
2 quarters, essentially. Yeah. Essentially. But see, I mean, that's the thing. That's why I'm guessing the UFC is pretty. That's why in terms of the winners, the fighters got more than I would have thought from a settlement. My guess would have been in the 100 to 200 million dollar range. So they ended up getting more than I would have thought. But from the UFC's perspective, if they don't have to make any significant changes, I'm sure they're just absolutely thrilled. And what should we expect going forward? Business as usual. And so that was kind of the main thing that I was saying all along about the antitrust case is don't expect, I didn't know how it was going to play out, but don't expect major contractual changes from this case. Don't expect that the business model of MMA is going to be flipped on its head from that case, from this case. It seems like if something like that would happen, it would be the legislative route now, but that's been stalled out for a while.
Interesting. You know, one last thing I just want to throw past you. So let's take two scenarios here, you know, because this is, I think, what the essence of the case is. If the fighters are saying the UFC stifled the marketplace, they bought Strikeforce, they bought, what was it, the World Fighting League, they bought the WEC, I forget whatever else, they bought a couple other organizations. So the fighters are saying that the salaries were artificially deflated because there was less competition. And yet you can point to, you know, I think a number of cases where fighters have left the UFC and said, Corey Anderson said, I'm making more in Bellator. Shane Burgos clearly made more when he went to the PFL, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did that reconcile with what the fighter argument would have been?
It didn't support it, which is what the UFC was going to be pointing out in the case. Although the interesting thing about the case is like Shane Burgos wouldn't have been a part of it. It was literally going to be a time warp ending in June of 2017, and the world beyond June of 2017 did not exist, right? So none of that would have been in this lawsuit, but it would have been in the second one. But those were the types of arguments the UFC and their expert witnesses were making. Hey, look, when this fighter switched, look what happened to their pay. Hey, when they went from Strikeforce to the UFC, look, their pay went up. When they made these moves, look what happened to their pay. And the plaintiffs will get around that by constantly saying, that doesn't matter. Look at our work showing that their wage share went down. So that was again, we're getting into more of the technical weeds here, but that was the battle that happened. The UFC kept trying to point out these examples of, look, this fighter did this and their pay goes up. Look, this event happened and pay goes up. and then the plaintiffs would always come back to, we have this grand statistical model that shows you are suppressing wage share, right? And so, but if there are problems with that and there are deep economic problems with using wage share, then that's the trouble that they were potentially in. But the question was, would a jury of 8 regular people be able to interpret and understand that? So the UFC was able to just, you know, get a knowable sum that they can easily deal with. And one thing I didn't realize is if they lost, if it was a big number, if it got tripled, it would kind of be like what Donald Trump is going through right now, right? Having to come up with that money for a bond in order to appeal. So depending on what the number was, that could have caused them a lot of problems down the line. So there are all these ways that it's a manageable figure, right? Don't have to come up with a bond. And again, if what Corey said is true, no contractual changes are some of the reasons I'd have the UFC as a winner too.
Let me one other question or two other questions. The MMA Fighters Association put out a statement on Twitter today, and I want to read it to you. And I want to get your take on actually the last part of the last sentence, because I think that's interesting. But they put on Twitter, today's decision is a victory for past, current, and future UFC fighters and moves us one step closer to our goal of making MMA a legitimate professional sport. And now here's the you know, I think MMA is a legitimate professional sport, but we'll add this is where my question comes, where wins determine title shots, not promoters. Okay. So, I mean, and I don't say this to be flip, but is their goal to change the way MMA is done to make it like the PFL and have a season, or like Bellator used to do, have tournaments? What do you make of that last part of that statement, where wins determine title shots, not promoters?
Yeah, I'm with the outcome of today as we know it. I'm not seeing that. I don't see the connection there at all. Plaintiff lawyers are probably getting $110 million, right? Fighters will be getting paychecks. Fighters will be getting payments. But in terms of making wins determine title shots, maybe you can help me, Kevin. I don't see it.
Yeah.
with what's happening. And Rob always goes off on his MMA is not a sport. When he says that, I'm just like, okay.
Rob Macy,
I
that
don't know
is.
what to do with that. I don't know what to do. It's not a sport complaint.
There's a bit this is an entertainment business too, and I want to make a comment and get you to react to my comment. So that there's an entertainment aspect to this, and you're trying to sell something on a Saturday night. You can go. I love hockey, so if I'm not watching a fight, I'm going to T-Mobile Arena to watch a Golden Knights play. There might be an NBA game on there. There might be a college football or college basketball, baseball game in the summer. You can go to a show in Las Vegas. A lot of things that you can do. So MMA is entertainment. So I think, isn't it incumbent upon, if you're trying to sell tickets and if you're one of the promoters that does pay-per-view, trying to sell pay-per-view shows, to make it as entertaining as possible. So I almost read that quote as like, well, maybe we can have wins determine title shots, but it's not going to be as entertaining. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't see anything in the events of today that is a bridge toward leading to that, right? But I get what you're saying, kind of the PFL product, and I don't think the PFL product is as entertaining, although they have different fighters as well. But the question is, what leads them to say that? What if there was something coming where they not only made a monetary deal with the UFC, but made some change to their contracts or some mechanism for how they match fights that it might not last forever. A lot of times the settlements, it'll be like, hey, for the next 5 years or 10 years, you have to do this, right? Or something like that. Then maybe I could see it. But from what we have heard today and what it seems like we understand is coming about possible contract changes, which seems to be nothing, I don't see how this drives that at all. It gets money to some people, that it does, absolutely. Right. But it doesn't seem to do much else. And keep in mind, from here on out, fighters have signed, if you're fighting for the UFC, you've signed an agreement that says you will not participate in any class action lawsuits. If again, what Nate Corey says is true, that clause will still be in there.
Interesting. So let's wrap it with this then, Paul. What can the fighters who are part of this class, and that's going to include fighters like George St. Pierre, Conor McGregor, because he fought from, I think, 13 through 17, so he was in the UFC at that time. Brock Lesnar, so some pretty big name athletes. Ronda Rousey was in the organization at that point. They're going to be getting money, but if you break it down, if we take away the lawyers' fees off the top, which you mentioned before, be in the 9-figure range, over 100 million, and other expenses that were associated with that, what do you think the average payout to a fighter is going to be?
I did just a back of the envelope calculation, and my rough calculation came out to, on average, $185,000 per fighter. But there's some serious caveats to this. One, we don't know how the Johnson fighters are going to be treated. That would add more fighters to the lawsuit, but yet some of them have signed class action waivers. So will they be even included in getting any money? Now, you can be in both and you'll get money for the first one and maybe not for the second one. But again, would they get money? There's a handful that haven't signed those waivers. What would they get? Would the money be allocated based on how many times you fought? Would it be allocated based on your pay? In theory, it probably should be based on your pay, because if what the plaintiffs are saying is true, the people who are most damaged were actually the Conor McGregors of the world. But I don't know that money is going to be allocated like that. So keep in mind that there are a lot of, when you think of averages in this sport, right, the kind of the ends that have their extremes at the end, right? You get like the Cowboy Cerrones and the Jim Millers who fought a ton of times, but then a lot of fighters only fight 1, 2, or 3 times and they're out. Right. So when we talk about an average being maybe $185,000, there would probably be a lot of people who get 20, 30,000, and then some people who get 600,000. I'm just ballparking everything.
Understood.
Right here.
Yeah.
But
there's a lot we don't know, but one of the things we do know is that nobody knows more about this case other than the lawyers and fighters involved than this man, Paul Gift. So, Paul, I appreciate you. Your expertise has been wonderful on this. Thank you for explaining a little bit of that to us, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Kevin. Anytime.
Appreciate it.